You know what? I just wanted to do this introduction because I feel partially responsible for this panel. Like every immersive mix that I do, Brandon and I do together. So we work on a lot of stuff. Obviously, he and I work together on everything, but he co-mixes the immersive stuff that I do, and pretty much every immersive mix that I do, either Pete or mostly Dan is the expert mastering guy that I lean on to make sure I didn't screw anything up, and if I did screw something up, he unscrews it. And it's I'm a huge believer in mastering for immersive because there's so many ways it can go south quickly, and so much stuff is changing so quickly. So I just wanted to say thank you for having these guys on here because without them, this wouldn't happen.
100%. Well, that's you can do it. They're clapping for you. No, so the whole reason that this panel is because, at least from my estimation, when we first started talking about it, was Nashville is ground zero for the Wild West of immersive, right? So Nashville has the largest population of immersive studios in the world. And right now, it's just getting wilder and wilder. So, or maybe darker before the dawn. And these guys have amazing horror stories on what they get sent. And that's such a problem. If we're going to help push the community forward in a positive way, we need to start getting better at this. So to me, it was, let's talk to the people who have to fix all the things. Oh, he's not here to say, I didn't swear this time. Yeah, and it's that thing. So we're here to talk about it. This panel will be different than the first one. We kind of want to do questions from the get if you want. We're going to talk a little bit, give it a little more of a precursor, but this panel feels like the one should be, question heavy. So if you don't have any questions, it's going to get weird. Fast.
I'd like to start with a question real quick.
Do you want me to introduce you?
Oh, sure.
That's Brandon. Brandon's wild. So Brandon's a robot lemon. We all met Danny Bag of Donuts earlier.
Sorry, I don't know how to say it.
That's totally fine.
And this is Infrasonic. Again, they are the guys that know the problem. So we were going to have Brandon start because he was stealing his line.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to ask how many of you guys are already doing immersive mixes? Okay. And how many are thinking about doing immersive mixes? Okay, cool. That's just, just wanted to read the room and see what kind of questions that we were
Is your mic technique going to be this the whole time?
maybe.
Professional
I might be
recording
here,
engineer.
Yeah. I'll pick the right mic, but I'm not going to talk into it whatsoever.
This is a mixing panel.
Yeah.
I mean, do we need the microphone?
We do.
We need
Yeah.
Because again, we got cameras. No, but like legit, you were going to start with a similar thought of,
Yeah.
what are you doing?
Totally. So I think Dan touched on it on the first panel, but I think it's a great way to start. Is there's two main fields of thought when it's coming to Atmos mixes currently. One of them is, okay, we want this Atmos mix to sound like the stereo mix, right? Like everyone's heard the stereo mix. We love the stereo mix. We want the Atmos mix as close to the stereo as possible. We get that a lot, for sure. The second side is, okay, here's the stereo mix, but we want to actually create in Atmos. We want to do, as much cool shit as we can in Atmos, which is less, but hopefully continues to rise as the technology comes forward. So we get different problems with both fields. The first field is when everything is like, we want to just like the stereo, right? And that's going to be probably the more predominant one. And the biggest problem with that is recreating the stereo mix first. So, the best way to do that, I don't know if we should just go into it.
Yeah. This is great.
The best way to do that, thanks, is to send stems as close to the stereo mix as possible. And that's a lot of an issue that some people have, whether it's like not running your stems through a mix bus. That creates a ton of problems in the Atmos mix, right? Because if you send me a drum stem and it's not going through any of your mix bus stuff, you've probably got compression on your mix bus. it's going to sound completely different. There's no glue to that mix. So one of the first things that I have to do is get it to sound as close to that stereo mix as possible, which could be a lot of work, so.
And that's without panning. You're keeping it pretty much left, right. You just try to recreate with the stems.
Correct. That's just getting it back to a place that we can even start doing the Atmos mix. So, one of the things that I would recommend if you're trying to send something off to get mixed is make sure that your stems sound like your mix as much as possible. And the other,
which again sounds like a no-brainer, right? Mm-hmm. Of course it should, but it happens a ton. And if you have to start guessing, well, obviously I'm listening to the song and it sounds pretty compressed. What do you think they used? How am I going to match that tone?
Exactly.
And now they're making creative decisions that you necessarily don't want someone to make for you, right? So,
would you bring in that stereo mix, put it down at the bottom as a reference, so you can click back and forth?
Yes.
Totally. Yeah. One of the requested things that we get for every Atmos mix, and this tends to be, like I said, the main field is the stereo mix is already out there, right? So we request the stereo master file before we do the Atmos mix. And we do that for a couple reasons. One is so I can reference it and get it as close as possible. Secondly, and Dan can speak to this more in mastering, the Atmos file and the stereo file need to be identically the same length. So when you're uploading it to your distributor, it's got to be the exact same length.
And really, they should be as close to sample aligned as they possibly can. So if someone's switching between spatial and non-spatial, correct.
That's what's looking for. One of them's going to get cut off.
Well, and they'll just get rejected.
Yeah, they'll just kick
they
it
won't
back.
even take the files unless they are the same length. So
Yes.
that's one part. Actually, yeah, that's a really good point because there's a whole when this all started coming out originally, there's also a speed limit volume-wise for Dolby Atmos. You can't submit files that have an integrated LUFS of higher than -18. And so when that originally came out, people were saying, oh, there's no need for mastering now. Like, we're not making things loud. And I think that really undercuts what mastering really is. Like, as people start thinking we're just this step to make things louder, that is just really far away from the truth. Our real goal is to make sure that what gets delivered by the creative people to distribution is exactly what everyone wants, is in a format that'll play for everyone, and that is consistent in all playback systems. And with a new format where there's so many different playback systems, it could be the binaural being played through Amazon, it could be Apple Spatial, it could be someone in a room, could be in a movie, like a different kind of codec. That we need people who have the ability to actually listen to all those systems and make sure it sounds really good on all those systems, even more so than stereo, just because they're all so different.
Can we either give a mic? I got a guy who can give a mic so we can get the questions on camera.
Oh, great idea.
Or just read one. Hey, Logan. Where'd Logan go? Just have it.
Logan,
Logan.
stereo. Okay, one more. Immersive.
Put it over there. Where's the intern?
Any other questions real quick? Because now we have Logan. Oh, we got one here. Yeah, you're going to get so many steps in today.
I love it.
Hi. Sorry, I know I kind of asked this in one of the last sessions, but just because I heard you say it again, the -18 limit, like, is that just going to become the new, like, what in stereo is the 0 dBFS? Like, are people, you think, just going to...
I mean,
Really good question.
honestly, from my perspective, and I could be completely wrong, it feels like, since, if you can believe Apple, which we should be able to believe mostly, 8 out of 10 people who listen to Apple Music are hearing the spatial first. They're not even hearing the stereo mix. So who knows when, but it feels like there will be a tipping point where everyone starts going, well, we should be doing this first. Mm-hmm. We should be doing the spatial, the Atmos, the immersive mix first, and then get the stereo to meet up. Because if you're going to hear it first, that's going to have to be the most important thing. Because currently, that's why we're all shooting to match it, so that way you're true to the artist. But then there's going to be a point when the artist is going to go, nobody's hearing this. I don't want to do this first.
And it's also two different kinds of loudness, like the -8 between stereo and Atmos. The -18 is like an integrated loudness of the file, which is different than a physical limit of bits I can use when I'm mastering to 0 dB full scale. And I can push things into that and actually get like RMS values that are very high. It's not the same kind of speed limit. So I think it's more malleable, like it can move. I think -18 might not stay the standard, but who knows? But yeah, as of now, it seems that that's what they want. So,
Thank you.
Something else I could say real quick. It seems like a lot of you guys are kind of working your way into Atmos. So just some like very simple stuff to think about. Like this is all perfect world. We get stems that sound exactly like the stereo mix. It's not going to happen. We deal with all sorts of different variations of that. We've Reed's mixed stuff that's a 2-track and a vocal, and we just you make it work. You find techniques that work out that way. But the main things that you can at least ask for, the master file for stereo, because you got to have something that you can reference that's final product, and a dry lead vocal stem seems to help. Like if you can get anything at all, try to get that dry lead vocal, and most people can accommodate that, because even if they buy a beat off the internet, you still got to cut that vocal, right? So as long as you can get the effect stem split out separately, that tends to help quite a bit with the Atmos delivery.
Do you ever want unaffected, like drums? So I know you said put it through all the mix bus, but do you want dry unaffected ever? Is there ever a chance for that? Because I've had some stuff where I've asked for, I want the kick separate, I want the snare separate, but I also want the full kit affected, so that way I can pepper in if need be. Is that something that you feel is a good approach, or do you think that it's no, just get what you get and party?
I think it could be, depending on the genre of music. Like if we're doing something more hip hop based, like getting a kick and like trap hats all separately, way better and more malleable. It comes back to the idea of like the more that we get, the more we can do, right? So if we have a 2-track drum track, we have a couple things that we'll try to do. If we have every single thing separately in a programmed drum kit, we have a lot more flexibility to move stuff around. And it also comes back to phase relationships. Live drum kit, I think we just take the drum stem, to be honest with you. If we got everything separate, it comes back to like, how can we get this to sound like the drum kit on the stereo song,
Well, and this all comes right back to the very first thing, which is you're describing there recreating something that exists already versus not. So again, it's probably much more common to get all of these pre-processed files when you're doing that, recreating a stereo mix that already exists, versus if you were going to do something new, like fresh out the gate in Atmos,
100%.
then you'd want all the drums individually so you can do the thing I would
100%.
guess, right?
Yeah. It comes down to the two fields of thought, the thought process behind like, and there's if there's a conversation between the artist or the producer or somebody that's like really jazzed about the Atmos mix, we've been able to do things where we did the Atmos mix first, and did the stereo mix after that, and it came out super cool. It's the exception right now. It's not the thing that we're probably going to experience most of the time.
But Dolby does talk about that. They they really want. I think I shouldn't speak for Dolby, but
You can.
go ahead.
Yeah,
from
you can.
from chats with people there, it seems like they want, the goal is that we mix in immersive, and then the fold downs work really well, and so the stereo fold down from that immersive mix should create a good stereo mix. In theory, that's what they're going for. And
So how much do you want to master that?
to be fair, I have never heard one. I have never heard something go through that process, so I'm not sure. But then there's another question: is when I get that version, am I mastering it to 0 dB full scale like stereo, or am I keeping it down at the -18? And I can tell you right now, if I delivered a -18 master in stereo to someone, I would get fired immediately.
super
So
kickback.
I don't know.
fire him. Maybe. No, exactly. Well, I mean, and that kind of goes back to, if we're going to switch to mastering for a second, because you're not getting stems.
Correct. So the way I have always worked so far is I ask for the ADM files from whoever's mixing it. Usually when it's with Brandon, it's Reed or Brandon. And since we're not all super familiar with all of it, we'll go through a really quick what the files are in Atmos. So when you play something through the Dolby renderer and it renders it out into this ADM file, contains all of the audio and metadata in PCM, full PCM, and that file has all the information that tells where objects and sounds should be, where they should appear in this 360 field. Then that file gets used through different mixdown processes to make a binaural version. That's what you can hear on Amazon. If you're listening to their spatial a lot of times. And you can make this MP4 file that is a simulated file, like what will happen when Apple Spatial goes through their process. It's not quite perfect, but it's a pretty good amalgamation of it. And the ADM file is the only one that's full res, all the PCM audio, like ready to go with everything. That's what I want. And that's what you'll actually end up giving to distributors when you distribute music. So that's usually, if there's a lot of objects and audio, it's like a multi-gig file. It's pretty big for one song. I get that, and I use Pro Tools when I work, and you can import that into Pro Tools using the import session data, and it will build the whole session, every audio file will be edited to the same length. It will all be panned correctly, and all of the metadata that tells the automation is also written in that file. So essentially, it plays back 100% the same. Whether he has it on his system or then I open it on mine, it's the same thing. The tricky part, though, is that I don't have I don't see this automation. I don't see the plugins you use. I don't see any extra routing. I just get baked done files. And so unlabeled. Actually, if you use Logic, you can get labeled files, and you can name the objects in the Dolby renderer in the binaural settings, and those names will also be put onto the ADM file. So if you're really clever, there are ways to do it. But yeah, so they're unlabeled. So the first thing I do is I bring it in, and I have to listen to every single track and reorganize it all and kind of make it make sense. And then we go through the process of putting in the stereo master. I bring in the stereo master that's already been approved, make sure that everything lines up and is exactly the same length, and that the fade outs follow the same thing. That's another thing. There's you gotta match all the different parts that another mastering engineer may have done to that stereo mix. You have to now incorporate into the Atmos mix. And that's basically my process for bringing it in. Import the things, organize the files. And what's kind of neat is, I treat it very much like mastering stereo, where I'm not trying to be super creative. If there's a problem, we'll address problems. But I am taking the finished mix and, making that shine as much as I can without getting too deep in it. But I also have individual control because I do have all these individual objects. So if the client says, oh man, this is great, but we just want like the guitar solo up just a little bit, it's cool. We don't have to go back to the mix. You don't need to redo all this stuff. I can open my session, find the guitar solo object, bump it up, and make those kinds of tweaks now in mastering that you would not have been able to do with a stereo.
It's a
file.
great team effort.
Well, and absolutely. And this goes back to the mastering panel, right? When we're talking about having to have a level of communication to make sure that all these things, if it was, nope, I did X, Y, and Z because I wanted X, Y, and Z, or, yeah, I just totally didn't hear that.
Correct.
You know what I mean? You have a safety net. I don't want to say fix it in mastering. You can fix it in mastering, everybody. Good luck.
Yep. No, there's definitely more of that now than there's ever been.
Well, and that's I think part of this whole learning process. Like you had said when you're describing the ADM importing, it is importing session data. It will not let you just import audio.
Correct.
Because it just goes, nope, don't know what this is, don't care, right? So when you do the session data, it really does come in and really interesting. I mean, I use Pro Tools, so it's always just been ugly.
It really is.
What is this?
Yeah. Well, they come in the order that the objects are numbered on the mixing side. So whatever order they've assigned objects, that's what they come in.
Yeah,
Not necessarily, no. Yeah.
But and it just says object 11, right?
Yes,
Or,
correct.
And so
001, 002.
confusing.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, I've got 400 questions, but I'll try to limit it to just a couple. But
Go.
so first, that whole workflow, and this is just like an aside, but if you bring up a guitar solo in the master, that to me opens an entire can of worms of archival, right? So if we come back to the mix session 10 years from now and the guitar solo went up in the master, I don't know, that seems really messy, but that's not really my question. It's just something that came to me. But I imagine there's going to be a really common workflow where someone can't afford to have an Atmos rig in their home studio or their small studio, and they're going to do a real-time binaural rendering. And I'd be curious, like, what you guys suggest for that workflow. Would it be send off an ADM, because you obviously can't send a Pro Tools session if you don't have the same plugins and all that kind of stuff? So I'm curious about that workflow. Should I rephrase that?
Sorry.
So,
yes, or just are you asking because you don't have because you were working in binaural? Should you send a binaural?
Well, okay, sorry.
essentially?
Yeah, sorry. I should be like it strikes me as if you have a client who wants Atmos mixes and you want to be in charge of that rather than just handing off a stereo mix to someone, I imagine there's going to be a lot of people putting on headphones and doing like a real-time binaural rendering. And then the safe bet in my mind would be either handing it off to another person to like co-mix it with you or
Sure.
whatever, or to a mastering engineer. This is the area that's gray for me. But
Gotcha.
it seems like it should be something that we should all, I imagine there's going to be a ton of people who want to essentially do the immersive mix in headphones and hand it off to someone who can have a space,
Make it right.
and
Yes,
make it-
you're still going to end up with an ADM. So the best way that you could do this now is in Logic. So Apple's Logic has built-in Dolby renderer in the software, and you can stream that directly to AirPod Pros or Maxes and hear either binaural, where you can use all of the binaural settings, or you can hear what it's going to sound like in Apple Spatial. That's actually another thing. So man, there's so much to. You're right. You've given me 400 answers to one question. So the binaural recording has all of these stereo field adjustments you can make in the renderer. You can put objects in either near, or what's the other one? Mid. And
Or off.
Off. And it sort of adds this like room ambience / I don't even know exactly what it does. But those settings all end up in only the binaural version and not in the Apple Spatial version. So what's cool about Logic is you can switch between the two of them in real time. And you can say, this is what it's going to sound like when it's Apple Spatial. This is what it's going to sound like when it's binaural. But you're still going to, at the end, export an ADM, because that's the only thing that can ever be delivered to be a certified Atmos thing, or whatever you call it, project. So you will have to render that, and then yes, give that to someone else is probably the best way. I would give them the ADM versus the session, just because sessions get kind of sticky with plugins and people's systems, and if they have something routed differently, who knows? But that's the basic. That's how I would do it.
Can't you do that in the Dolby Atmos renderer? Can't you do like a binaural mode?
Yes, you can. You can do binaural, but you can't do the Apple Spatial encoding side of it. Sure. So that's the one missing link. You can export the MP4 and then listen to that on Apple headphones and get the same effect, but it'll do it in real time with Logic, which is just saves time.
And they're different enough that you really do need to hear both. Like
Yeah,
they are
for sure.
Okay.
radically different.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
I do. It's interesting because I do wonder if it feels like Apple is putting their thumb on the scale here in a lot of ways. And Apple is a very powerful company. We saw them took Facebook's revenue like 50% just with a flip of a switch and an iOS update.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are a powerful company. I would wonder if they really lean into Logic, the newest version of Logic. I could almost see it overtaking Avid in some way just because they're so powerful. But also, I don't know how much they care about Logic. You know, Apple. Like if you look at like an Apple operating system, Apple iOS, it's all really slick. Logic doesn't feel as slick to me. It doesn't feel like an Apple product, but I would wonder if how much they might lean into that with stuff like what you just mentioned, the immersive audio aspect, the spatial music being built into it. It feels like it's going to really start carrying a lot more weight than it used to.
I would say Apple cares pretty heavy about Logic because, if they don't care, they're just going to get rid of it, and you're never
I
going
guess
to hear about it again. Cube.
It doesn't feel as slick as like their other products or something.
No, 100%.
Yeah.
I mean, remember, it's not their product, right? It's been evolved to their product, but it was eMagic, you know.
Right.
And then when they bought them, there was the huge 6-month panic of when is it going to leave PCs, and then gone. So I don't think that it's something that they're not interested in.
That's also the engine behind,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm saying that, but they're not going to abandon that.
Yeah, no.
I would say right now, if you're trying to get into doing Atmos mixing and you're doing it on headphones, there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be doing it on Logic. Having the ability to hear the Apple render is amazing. The cost is much lower than any other thing that you're going to use to do it on, and it just makes all the sense in the world to me. Because you're going to export the ADM anyway if you're talking about sending it off to somebody else in a room to check it. Yeah, do it that way.
Logan?
So this is just a quick point of clarification. The Apple Spatial that you're talking about is still basically a binaural mix, but that's the version you're going to hear through Apple Music, and then the binaural version is the one you hear through other streaming
So
services?
yes, although the way the Apple one works is actually not using any of the binaural settings. The Apple file is made from a 5.1 crash down of the ADM. So Apple takes the main ADM, whatever you're working in, crashes down to 5.1, then uses that encoding to make Apple Spatial files. And it doesn't use any of the binaural settings. So none of the near, mid, far, none
And it
of that
doesn't sound the
takes it.
same.
And it doesn't sound the same. So that's how that process is slightly different, and why it's hard to ever really preview quickly or easily what it's going to sound like in Apple Spatial, unless you have Logic running it. So.
The easiest difference to spot for me is the smiley face curve. I feel like that Apple Spatial has. There's just so much more low end, and then according to mastering, Dan has found like in some of our mixes, like on Apple Spatial, there's more sibilance. at high
Correct.
end as well.
Yeah, right up around like really high, like 11K, there'll be S's and things will poke out in this really strange way that I won't hear until I get into Spatial on Apple headphones. But also, as I learned recently, the Apple version apparently uses the LFE channel. So there's an LFE channel in the bed of a Atmos mix. The Apple version uses the LFE channel, and the binaural version does not. It just completely ignores it. So right there, if you're mixing a lot of things into that LFE channel, the Apple version is always going to be bass heavy compared to the binaural version. So yeah, big give and take there for sure.
I think one other thing that's like I kind of try to remember as well, and it's something that like I am going to reinforce more in the future is the format is Dolby Atmos, right? It will always be Dolby Atmos. The room, the way it sounds in the room is going to always sound like that. The binaural is always going to sound like that. The Apple Spatial could change tomorrow, right? It could change next week. They could do whatever the F they want with it.
Yeah.
You can swear. It's okay.
Cool. So in your priority list when you're doing an Atmos mix, the room, to me, this is personal preference, but the room, then binaural, then Apple Spatial is how I grade those, right? So they sound different. I mean, Apple Spatial sounds different than binaural. You're going to have to make adjustments, just like listening on different pairs of speakers. I would trust the room the most, right? So that's why you can do it on headphones right now, but are you going to be happy with your mix in 5 or 10 years when maybe
Or 6 months.
Or 6 months, yeah.
You are the unfortunate part about obviously the cost of entry is difficult, but if you're not hearing it on speakers, you really don't know what's happening because it's got to do all the tricks to make it work in the headphones. So I'm going to back you on that. You're completely correct. The room is the boss because now you have a clue of what's really happening, and then you reference everything else to make sure that, that works. Is that fair?
100%.
And it's very strange since we don't actually listen in rooms very often to it. Like, as the consumer is not going to be able to do that.
But that could change,
Yeah.
Like my hope is that binaural goes away at some point, and we're actually listening to like a more similar version of what we're hearing in the room because it's so fucking cool in the room.
It is cool.
Audio is going to be probably the most similar.
Yeah, that's true. People do that.
Sweet spot's weird. I think there's only one car company. Mercedes is the only one right now where you can pick your sweet spot in your car.
That's cool.
So yeah, right. That's some math.
Since we're talking about the room, though, I mean, don't you think we're not that far away that we don't have to have 64 speakers, 11 speakers we can do it all from 2 speaker sources within a room. I mean, we know that's coming.
Sure.
So we're back to still listening into the room, but we don't have to worry about buying 11 speakers.
Well, I think it's if you're going to go that route, it's not going to be 2 speakers. It's going to be 2 boxes with a bunch of elements, right? That's what these sound bars are. So what I don't know if anyone here from Sennheiser, it's got like 13 elements or something. Does anyone know? Their sound bars just got a ton of speakers. So I think that the method of delivery can change, but you still have to be able to have all these different directional elements to actually have a representation.
Well, and that's where Atmos shines, right? It's that it's no longer channel-based, track-based, or speaker-based. It is just information with audio. And so it does not matter where speaker placements go or where playback systems go, as long as you have the full range audio and it knows where it's supposed to be, it should integrate with anything in the future. So that's kind of that was the whole thinking with it, I feel like, from the beginning.
And that's why the new Sonos box, right? That's got 6 elements in it. The Apple reissued the HomePod, and that has 5 in it. And then you can pair those up, and then you've got more of an immersive feel. But if you're creating the content, it's really nice to hear it come from behind you, to know where it sits behind you, instead of an averaging or an estimation or I think that's right. Personally.
Yeah.
So that's going to be difficult for me to ask this question, I think.
Because it's a strange world we live in now, because vinyl sales are outperforming everything else, right? And at the same time, we're getting pushed in the digital space potentially completely away from stereo at some point. So really, this I guess is more focused on the spatial. Do you see a time when the mix bus becomes obsolete? Because really, if you wanted to keep things more spatial, then you would just forget that, right? And that way you'd make sure that, you might have a drum bus, but you wouldn't have a mix bus.
Sure.
Is that making sense?
I think before we see that, there will be a bridge, because people hold on to things that they know work, right? So you tell someone they can't use a mix bus anymore, they're going to try to figure out how to use mix bus, right? So there are going to be plugins, I think, more and more tools to implement certain things. We use some that are buggy as shit, and sometimes work, sometimes don't, but they kind of look at all of the tracks or the objects or whatever, and they kind of create a phantom mix bus in a sense, that work together. At some point, yeah, it'd be, maybe the more that we do immersive first, then that could change. The biggest issue that we had doing immersive first was one level, trying to get an immersive mix to sound great, and then also delivering the same mix as stereo without a mix bus, right? So it's I think there needs to be certain things that change before that's going to happen, like on a great scale. But I bet people could do it right now. I bet Serban could do it.
Yeah. So what can't he do?
Right.
But you bring in an interesting question, because I also
try for sure.
well, I also cut vinyl records. So you bring up an interesting point, though, which is when you have something like spatial, if it's extremely dynamic and isn't at all compressed in any, and let's say you have a record that has a lot of low end and all this crazy stuff on the sides and all around behind you, once that gets thrown down into, you have to cut stereo for vinyl, right? So those elements are very easily going to make very uncuttable files. If you have things with out of phase low information, if you have giant spikes in volume all over the place, that's just not going to be cuttable. So I'm not sure how. Yes, like you would still need some sort of mix bus processing to bring that back to being something you can actually put on a physical record.
I will say something else that's kind of interesting that we've noticed is with certain mixes, say we don't get all of the compression on the mix bus in the stems or whatever. Reed has been able at times we switch from the stereo reference to the 2.0 crash down. 2.0 crash down sounds pretty fucking good. Like it almost sounds better sometimes than the stereo could be, depending on the mixer. And I think depending on the dynamic range, I really think the drums at times can sound way punchier and just hit harder in the 2.0 crash down than the actual stereo mix, because everything's so squashed.
I mean, it kind of comes down to you, or at least I'd love to hear it. Are you becoming a better mixer because of it? You don't have what I'm going to call as a crutch of I'm just going to wail into my mix bus, and that'll be just what I do. I don't think since you can't do that, be better.
I think I'm definitely becoming a better mixer, but it's just one, doing it more, 10,000 hours kind of thing. But also, I think immersive mixing is a different part of the mixing brain, right? You're doing different things. You're not doing as much fixing tracks. You're not going in and listening and like, oh, checking, certain EQs or whatever. Like the track is done for the most part on that element, but you're learning a lot more about space and placing things and balancing things.
These relationships.
Yes, yeah, and all that stuff becomes extremely important in stereo as well. But it maybe like hammers home a little bit different part of your brain, like when you're mixing, and I think that's really cool. And I think for someone like me who's like starting mixing stereo just recently before mixing Atmos stuff, like I have a different view on it. I think the immersive stuff is gonna like really push me to be better in stereo as well, because I now think about this stuff a lot differently, or at least a lot faster than maybe if I was just doing stereo.
Anyone else? Oh, there we go.
Is there any form of media that you guys think doesn't make sense to mix immersive? So I work in podcasting, do a lot of mixing there, and so some of my clients have been talking about where is that going, and it's not something that they're requesting quite yet, but it's in their minds. But I'm curious if you guys think there's any form of media that doesn't make sense.
Go for it.
Yeah, so I think that podcasting is like saying it's all of music. So you got to look at podcasting with all of its different genres inside of it, right? So if you're going to do full storytelling where you can add more elements and you can make it feel like a space, that makes sense. If it's a two-person interview, that would freak me out to have someone sitting behind me in the interview. You know what I mean? Because I'd be like, this is so creepy. So I think you just have to do a genre thing.
Yeah, no, I think that totally makes sense. And you reminded me of something else with that question, which is, as of right now, we're still a little bit in the Wild West. The rules are still being, decided on. But we had a situation where a music project got mixed, and it was just like, I think it was just acoustic guitar and vocal. And it was only in a bed, and it was basically stereo. It was an Atmos ADM, but it was basically stereo, and it got rejected by, I can't remember who it was. I don't remember which, it was Apple or whatever, but they said it wasn't spatial enough. So in some ways, I don't love that. It feels like a little bit of handcuffing as a creative, like you're telling me I can't make the art I want to make. And I think that there's going to have to be come to Jesus moments with things like podcasts for that same reason, because you don't want people sitting behind you and whatnot. And I'm hoping that this is more of just like that initial phase where they really want people to lean into it so we can all understand and hear what spatial is, and then we'll back off and let it be more of just a creative tool. Because I think you'll run into things like that where it's going to be real weird if that happens. And you can also put your phone in a mode where it will do like pseudo spatial right now if you have an iPhone with the AirPods. And I accidentally had that happen to me on listening to a podcast, and it was bizarre. Like it was just all of a sudden it sounded like everyone was in a room that was like 20 feet by 20 feet. And I don't think that's very helpful. It was much more difficult to understand everything. And I can't imagine how many other people are just listening to podcasts like that and have no idea that that's even happening.
But the storytelling stuff actually sounds pretty wicked.
Yeah, no, right?
Yeah,
right?
like the
if you need an
murder
environment,
mystery,
that'd be great.
all that
That'd
kind of,
be
because it's
great.
cool. You get a little bit freaked out. You're like, what the hell? No, totally. I will say that probably was Apple that kicked it back, and it's because early on, I think a lot of people went, "Holy crap, I can make some money at this," and they just started slamming out bad content by doing, I'm going to throw a stereo, I'm going to throw a reverb, maybe a delay, call it immersive because I hear it behind me, and nobody was checking. Yep. And at a certain point in time, someone's going to go, well, this is crap. So
the Apple spatial playlist is crazy. It is
all over the map.
Because you can go from one to the next one. You'd be like, oh, Manny American did this one, dope. Oh, I don't know who the hell did this one, and it's right next to each other, man.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
It's wild because of it, and at least I know it's hard to pull a song down, but you can replace it, right? So if you have bad content up, you might not get another job, but then all of a sudden you hear your song and you're like, well, that wasn't what I did. Because it's not physical. It's not like they have to repress it and call it something different. They can upload something and go, cool, moving on. So the need for better content is really, truly shown. Because you don't want to just cheat and try to slam out as many songs as you can in a day. That's not art. That's not fun.
So to that point, for artists who are looking to create brand new content in Atmos, how should they be preparing for it? Like, you guys are kind of at the end of the production, so you can kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. Like, what should artists, does it make sense to throw up 24 mics in a single room, or
Why not?
should they be prepped?
Yeah, why not?
You are at the beginning of the production.
This is a good question.
I would say, obviously, it depends on the artist and the budget and like where you're cutting a song and yada yada yada. But when Reed gets to record something, we're usually in a great room, Blackbird, Ocean Way, whatever, and there's not a ton of extra work to put up an extra microphone on the acoustic guitar because he knows he's going to mix it. So we start thinking about that at the recording part. It doesn't necessarily come from the artist or the producer even per se. I'm sure it could, but that just kind of comes from Reed's own creativity and curiosity. We'll throw up extra mics and we'll be like, oh, maybe we'll try this for Atmos, As far as being an artist, I think that excitement has to be there to show them that, hey, you can create this cool shit, right? And headphones right now aren't the best way to do that. You get somebody in a room, like at the keynote earlier today, they were talking about getting the band or the artist into a room and listening to whether it's their stuff in Atmos or some cool stuff that's in Atmos. I think that really draws more interest in people creating for it. And hopefully we get to that point. Right now, it's still a lot of like, here's a stereo mix, do an Atmos mix. And we've been able, some of the stuff that we've done, the artists has come in and listened to it, and they've been like, wow, like this is super dope. I didn't even know it was going to sound like that. So maybe on their next project, they'll be like, we want to do the Atmos for this. Like at the start, we know we want to do it instead of at the back end of like, oh, so now we did the stereo. I thought it was done. No, we got this whole other process to go through.
And obviously there's a lot of manufacturers now that are making stuff. Voyage Audio has a really cool Dante mic that's, I think, 6 capsules on it, and then you have the GUI in the computer, and you can really do whatever you want with it. And a lot of companies are doing that, so you can have this more specialized microphone. But there's absolutely no problem, I would say. If I worked it here, I would want to do at least the corners just to have extra mics, just so I can hear the room. And if something magical happens and you want to take the direction of, I want it to be live raw, then I can have the room exist. And then you just play with it. Because again, throwing up a couple mics, 26, no, but an extra 4 isn't going to hurt.
And I think a lot of mix decisions are where that's going to be made. It's like from that production standpoint, when you're mixing it, you're no longer thinking about stereo. It's there. You're like, oh, I'm going to put that shaker like here. I'm going to add this verb over in these areas. And that's where those intentional decisions, I think, will get made more than in the actual recording start of it. That's my guess. I'm not 100% certain.
I love a good Atmos shaker.
I know, right?
Freaking you out.
Love it.
What is happening?
Keep it spinning around your head.
So we're already a bit over, but let's do Mr.
I just
Eastock.
want to pipe in one thing to the immersive thought. So there's this guy named Morten Lindberg who does tons of crazy orchestral recordings, and he's not necessarily an Atmos guy. He's like a DSD OG immersive guy, but he does immersive arrays in the ceiling, and you can download his DVDs. And he literally puts them in top of churches, and he makes them as if they were 714 or 914 rigs, just with microphones, and they're incredible.
That's awesome.
Yeah, so if you want to see that, Morton, Morton, Lindberg, Lindberg. Yeah.
So how much are you seeing right now where it's like somebody trying to create the recording space as opposed to whatever else?
Me, never, but
Rarely, you know. There are still a lot of people that don't know what Atmos is. You know, we're in a niche community in this room right now that at least like have a small grasp of what it is, right? And I think Apple's really pushing it quite a bit. I think that's helping immensely. I think when Spotify gets off their ass and maybe like does something with Immersive, that's going to get a lot of people more interested in it as well. Because I know a lot of my friends that aren't in music, they've like maybe heard the word, or like they have AirPods and they're like, why does my music sound kind of weird? You know, I'm listening to AC/DC or something, and, you know. But we're still at that point of like trying to teach people, trying to educate, and trying to get more people excited about it. So I'd say, to answer your question, like at this point, rarely.
I will say I've got 2 kids, and they're Spotify kids. And when I finally went, can you please just use Apple Music? They pay better. They put it on, and I picked a song, so I played them a Taylor Swift song, and they both went, yeah, what is that? What did you do? And when they heard it, they took a second to understand there's something different happening. They listen to it more now. They want to hear it more. What?
What did it default to? What format? What was the?
Oh, so it was off of my phone, so it was already set for spatial. Yeah. So they were listening to Taylor Swift in spatial, and they could hear it and they could feel it because they've heard it a million times.
yeah, they knew it was different immediately.
Yeah,
Like, oh,
exactly. Because
yeah.
they're like, why does that get shifted and weird? But I don't want to get screamed at by them, so we'll do one last question. And anyone? Or are we all happy?
We answered every question.
Yes.
Could you just?
Start over.
Well, so I guess like maybe the confusion for a lot of people not understanding the different platforms, or the not knowing Atmos or whatever, is that each company's got their own word for it, right?
Right.
So is there maybe an importance to the community overall to have a name that kind of registers what this is?
In my mind, yeah, we're sort of in the VHS Betamax time period of all this right now. The overarching word for me is immersive, means not stereo, some sort of 3-dimensional sound thing. From there, you know, you have Dolby Atmos is one encoding system format. Sony 360 is another, and then from those you get the binaural, the Apple Spatial, and whatever Sony calls the 360 released one. It's probably just 360, right? They just keep it that. Yeah.
I think it's 360.
And so yeah, you're right. You have that hierarchy, but I think it's just going to take a little time until we figure out who wins or whatever. But I think immersive is my overarching theme for it.
I think that we're not going to lose Sony 360 or Dolby Atmos, and Apple sure isn't going to let someone else tell them how to do things.
Yep.
So we're going to have the 3 for probably some
And Google's
time.
coming.
And Google's coming. So that's going to be weird.
I don't know what they're going to do.
Thank you guys for coming. I hope you enjoyed the panel. Thank you.